Hello, folks. Welcome back to English 420 Comparative Literature. This is going to be a video lecture on Module 4's essay on Homegoing, a novel by Gyasi. And this is our third novel of the semester. So what I'm going to do is, before I'm going to use some slides, images to contextualize the novel, the author, and then I'm going to look at, the assignment itself, which is due a week from today on October 24th. And remember, it's only a, 3 to 5 double-spaced page essay. It's not meant to be a research paper per se. And I just need to say, kind of at the outset here, that it's kind of evident that some of you, not all of you, but some of you are not actually following this prescribed outline here. Notice the directions say very clearly, follow this outline. And I bring this up because I'm trying to take the guesswork out of it for you. That if you just follow this outline with textual evidence and the body paragraphs here, then you're going to have a solid essay. And what I'll do is I will refer to these 5 essay topics by using this list of textual evidence. Now, this isn't something I've done before for the 2 previous novels, but this is also a much longer novel. So what I've done is I've culled, if you will, or collected a bunch of quotations, passages, evidence, so that you can then just go in and, use these in your body paragraphs to support whichever essay you are choosing. So, the first one here says religion and racism, because topic number 1 asks, how or in what ways does religion reinforce or perpetuate racism in homegoing, right? And then explain clearly and thoroughly by citing examples from the novel. Well, this whole section here are specific examples from, the novel for that first essay topic. And I will, in this video lecture, walk through some of them with and for you, but I'm not going to do every single one because it will be an incredibly long video lecture. Again, it's already a long novel at about 300 pages. The second issue is about the principle or tenet of critical race theory, saying that slavery is ordinary. Is it? Do you agree? Well, there are a bunch of examples to perhaps support that. Question number 3, essay question number 3 is asking about the black stone. It's asked how or in what ways does the black stone necklace function as a foundation for a braided or interwoven narrative structure. And if you read the novel, which I hope you have or are doing, you will see that it's as the ancestry on the sort of preparatory pages right before the title page shows. It's a story about the lineage, if you will, of 2, I guess we could say, half-sisters. And therefore, it's a kind of interwoven narrative. I'm asking how the black stone necklace functions as a structure for that. Number 4 is about storytelling as historical revision, because in this novel, of course, it is a story, or really a series of stories, that in some ways revises the history of what the characters think of themselves and their ancestors and the African diaspora. The 4th question or excuse me, the fifth question is about colorism. We've already had this question previously in the other two novels, and there's a bunch of examples that point to characters' awareness of, light-skinned or dark-skinned, and what does that mean for a sense of self, but also a sense of, as the essay number 5 suggests, of how it functions as a mechanism of oppression when you other, if you will, people through the lightness or darkness of their skin. So that's how we will be proceeding in this video lecture. And let me go ahead and kind of contextualize the novel here. And you guys have these images already in your what do you call it, Google Drive folder of Gyasi. So speaking of number 3, I believe, question number 3 about the necklace, here are some common themes that run throughout the novel that you could say that it symbolizes. And again, I'll be showing you some quotations, passages that speak to these themes directly, but it's a novel, excuse me, it's a symbol of friendship, right? Because it's given from one person to the other, but also, it really kind of has its origins in Mame, who is a kind of, she is referred to it throughout the novel, but she's not a character herself because she's, as we learned, sort of a house girl, if you will, as she's called, of one of the founding fathers of Effia's line. It represents a kind of interweaving of the family because it, takes place in some ways in both realms, both in Africa, both in the United States. The stone itself is black, so Gyasi is playing with deliberately, color here, the darkness, the blackness of the black stone, which is referred to a lot, represents the African diaspora or diaspora. That is, the spread of people within Africa around different parts of the globe, particularly through slavery, because it ends up, should be no spoiler alert here because you're reading or have finished a novel, ends up in Marjorie's hands. And she grows up a lot like the novelist herself. Gyasi grows up in Alabama in the South. It also represents, however, a loss of tradition because of what happens to the stone at the end, but also that there's a kind of disconnect, even though it's symbolizing ancestry. There's a kind of disconnect with people understand and know about the origin of the stone. But simultaneously, like I said, it's a connector of lineage, beginning with Mame, and it's also can be seen as a comfort in a person or character's identity. You'll see a constant reference to characters touching it. In times of stress or anxiety, or it gives them comfort to know that it's there. So those are just some of the themes that the stone can symbolize, but let's move on to the novelist herself. So this is her, Gyasi. She's actually born in Ghana to Ghanaian parents, and but was raised in the southern U.S., particularly in Alabama, where her father is a French professor. Then she goes to Stanford for her bachelor's degree, which, Stanford is not we call a proper Ivy League, but it's, kind of considered the Ivy League of the West in California. So, she starts off with some really solid academic chops. And then she goes on to the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. And this is a well-renowned writers, both poetry and short story and fiction workshop that has turned out some of the strongest and most notable authors in the past and present. So as the title as well as the image here suggests, this is a kind of braided narrative, right? That it's about, in some ways, two half sisters who don't really know each other, right? But kind of through the grapevine, if you will, come to know each other. And this is not, like the high school homecoming, but it's homegoing from this African tradition that, when you die, your spirit or soul goes back to its homeland. So I would recommend, if you have time, to listen to this short little, like 7 minute YouTube video of her explaining her genesis and motivation for writing this novel. It's pretty informative. I'm not going to play it here because you can watch it on your own, but just, in YouTube, search for the author's name, Gyasi, Homegoing. And it's published by the publisher itself, the Penguin Books. Here she is at a reading, speaking event, another one, right? And this was the original original cover art, which has, some, as you can see, kind of, there's two lands, if you will, right? One you could say is Africa, and one is, the southern U.S., where, the novel is set toward the last half or part two of the novel. Here she is again being interviewed. This book, by the way, won her a National American Book Critics Award, which is, pretty laudable award. Okay, so the background of this novel, it begins in Western Africa, particularly what is present-day Ghana. And at the time, at the opening of the novel, it wasn't called Ghana, but we're talking here about this, what is compared to the United States, small country here. So there's some evidence to suggest that the Akan people, as you can see here, excuse me, that they migrated from what is present day sort of Middle East, say Israel, through Egypt and across the Saharan Desert down to the west coast of Africa. So the reason I bring this up, because their language and their dialects are, quite a bit different from other peoples in this West Coast region. As you can see here, there are many, many different African language groups. And we're looking here at the Akan people, who collectively, that's sort of an umbrella term for tribes, if you will, that you will come across in the novel, particularly Asante and Nifante. So we're here looking at, in the novel anyway, sort of two regions. The Asante region, right, which is what they kind of in the novel refer to as the North. And so in this novel, these people, the Asante, are largely, although there are other people in this region, but they are largely the ones who become captives and sold into slavery by the people here in what's called the central region, by the Fonte, right? So they all sort of speak, this language called Akan, but there are different dialects, and that's referred to in the novel as well. So here's a map showing the kind of river system throughout Ghana. And this is part of the reason that the entire region, but especially Ghana, becomes important for the colonists and the slave trade, because the river systems are very naturally rich in things like gold and silver and coal and just natural resources that human beings, well, still seek, right? So there at the bottom you'll see is the Cape Coast, and that is referred to throughout the novel. And it's a real place, as I'll show you. So the beginning of the novel is sort of set around, and maybe she does it deliberately, the author sets it around the origin of the American nation. That is, it opens in roughly 1775, when the American colonies, right, are on the brink of war with Britain, to the following year, 1776, declare its independence. And so, that's what we call the late 18th century. And this map here is showing, around or circa 1800, not too long after that, what the sort of tribal system looked like. And what I've done here is highlighted in red for lack of a better term, the captors, the enslavers of people from the Asante land, right? So again, these people, the Asante or Ashante, spelled differently, pronounced differently, they are largely through tribal warfare captured and then forced into being prisoners and house girls and slaves, basically, to the Fonte, and the Fonte then sell them to the highest bidder, basically, to the Dutch, you'll see here the Dutch and the British, right? The Dutch and the British and other colonists. Here are actual Asante people, with their sort of tribal leader there on like what looks like a throne, if you will. So, these are real people and were real people. There's a real history there. And what Gyasi is trying to do is kind of re-portray that, through what she's learned about her own Ghanaian heritage through her family. This is an image here you can see of enslavement, basically, kind of encapsulating what's going on in the early part, or part one of the novel. You have people here who are, taken prisoners and enslaved. And then you have, people like down here, the British or Dutch or soldiers, taking the slaves away. So they, both Akan peoples, both tribes, have their own culture, their own dialect, their own, mores and values. And they share some cuisine, they share some religion, But we learn, from the different interwoven narratives that they behave and think differently, right? Which informs characters later in the novel. So I was just using that image to show you that there's, a rich history among all of these tribal people. So this is a map roughly about of the time with, instructions, to the boats, right? In the rainy season, vessels should anchor 10 fathoms within the castle, right? And there is the castle, or map of the castle. And this is where the Fonte, because we're down here on the coast now, there's all of these are fathoms, right? Depth in the water. This is where the Fonte would come and capture and then sell the enslaved people. And notice, I want to point out there's a chapel here inside the sort of grounds, if you will, of the castle. And that speaks to question one about, religion and racism. So here's a photograph of the actual Cape Coast Castle, real place. Many people go to it. It was a fortified, slave trading point for many, many decades. And here is someone you might recognize at the Cape Coast Castle, and that is our former president, Barack Obama. In 2009, he took his family there to see, and this is inside one of the dungeons where they would hold people until they were put on ships across, what's called the Middle Passage or the Atlantic travel. And this is referred to, this kind of dungeon, in chapter 2 and following, about just the horrors of people living in filth and degradation. So here's again the Obama family, 2009, being told about the history of people from here, both the slave holders as well as those in slavery. And there's a commemorative plaque here about the Obamas visiting. So there we go, 2009, right? And this is sort of famously or infamously, really, the outside, because you're looking inside of here of the castle. It's called the Door of Return. If you ever made it back, but most people did not, because on the inside, right, is what's called the Door of No Return. So this is the outside, but if you're on the inside, this is the door that would have been opened to the sea where the ships were waiting. A second, oops. So there it is, the the door of no return. And this, I point this out because it's referred to in the novel, but the castle itself is a kind of cultural memory anchor for the author and the characters. All right, so now I've kind of contextualized the author and the novel. Let's look at some of the textual evidence that you can include here in your body paragraphs, right? To argue for or against, the question. So the first one is how or in what ways does a religion reinforce or perpetuate racism and homegoing? So the two, not surprising, the two sort of religions that come in conflict with each other are the African tribal religions of the Asante and Fante, versus Christianity, typically through the missionaries. So here's an example on page 16. And, it says here, parenthetical numbers refer to page numbers in the print version of this novel. So if you're using, some other version like a Kindle or something, you may not have the same page numbers, but I suggested, if not required, you to buy the print version. So we're all literally on the same page. So on page 16, she and James were married by a clergyman who had asked Aphia to repeat words she didn't mean in a language she didn't understand. So this is when Aphia and James, or James Collins, who is a British soldier, are getting married in the chapel that I just showed you there by the coast. And of course, she doesn't speak English, and she certainly has not converted to Christianity. So it's this kind of marker fairly early on in the novel to show us that, that it's a kind of sham, right? That Christianity is, at least in the eyes of Aphia, like a joke, because you're asking me to say these words, but I don't know what they mean, nor do I believe them, right? A few pages later, this is a reference to Aphia, again, married to James Collins, and they use the word wench, which of course is a derogatory term for a woman. Wench was something else entirely, a word the soldiers used to keep their hands clean so that they would not get in trouble with their God, a being whom himself was made up of three, but who allowed men to marry only one. That is, the Trinity versus polygamy. Because, of course, in the novel, as many African tribes did, and some still do practice, you could have multiple wives as a male. And it goes on to point out on that same page that James actually already has an English wife back in England named Anne and two children. So, he's a polygamist and therefore a hypocrite in the eyes of, Christian theology and the Bible. Let's see. James to Aphia upon the traditional tribal wedding night. Now, they had one in the church, and then they were going to have another one, to sort of appease or placate Aphia's father. Now, Aphia, and this is James talking to her, his wife. Now, Aphia, I don't want any voodoo or black magic in this place. My men can't, his soldier, sorry, my men can't hear that I let my wench place strange roots under the bed. It's not Christian. He had spoken before, too, of the voodoo he thought all Africans participated in. She could not tell him the fables of Anansi the spider or other stories of the old people from her village used to tell her without growing wary. Since moving to the castle, she discovered that only the white men talked of black magic. Sorry, that should be although. I'm sorry. Although black magic had a color, the need to call this thing good or this thing bad, this thing white or this thing black, was an impulse that Aphia did not understand. In her village, everything was everything. Everything bore the weight of everything else. And, you could again tie this back into the stone, the black stone, right? But also there's tinges of course, race and racism here. But the reference here, what the author calls Fable of Anansi the Spider, this is part of the Akan, what we might as Judeo-Christians call, mythology, but it's part of the the religion of the Akan people, that Anansi, who's a sort of trickster spider, weaves webs that, in fact, as you can see here, that they, practice kente, the cloth, the beautiful, vibrant colored cloth. So a few pages later, it says, two Asante men went out into the forest one day. And this is, basically the story of how kente, the cloth, comes into being. They were met by Anansi, the mischievous spider. He was spinning a magnificent web. They watched him, studied him, and soon realized the spider's web is a unique and beautiful thing, and that a spider's technique is flawless. They went home and decided to weave a cloth the way Anansi weaves his web. From that, kente was born. So I include this because it's a direct contradiction to these sort of stories, if you will, in the Bible about how things come to be. It's, to use the sort of fancy term, it's called an etiological narrative, or a story of origins about how something came to be. In this case, the kente cloth. But it comes from, this mischievous spider, Anansi, who's kind of one of the core figures in the Akan religion, as I mentioned. Excuse me. So a little bit later in the novel, this is Ma Aku to Joe. Joe is a male. And don't be thrown by some of the characters' names. Excuse me. Like Willie is actually the name of a female, we learn later. But this is Ma Aku, who's basically his mother to her son. The white man's God is just like the white man. He thinks he is the only God, just like the white man thinks he is the only man. But the only reason he is God instead of Noame or Chaku or whoever he is, because we let him be, is because we let him be. We do not fight him. We do not even question him. The white man told us he was the way, and we said yes. And when has the white man ever told us something was good for us and that thing was really good? They say you are an African witch, and she's talking about herself in the third person. They say you or I am an African witch, and so what? So what? Who told them what a witch was, right? So again, a kind of juxtaposition between religion and that there's this ongoing tension between characters, especially older characters, not wanting to give up their tribal or African religions, right? And it's always kind of struck me, honestly, the tenacity, if you will, and fervor of quite literally African-Americans in the United States who have adopted Christianity as a religion. And, I understand it's in many ways imposed upon them, either convert or die kind of thing in slavery. But, that was not their religion, when they came across the Atlantic or the Middle Passage. Similarly, in Northern Africa, there are a lot of now Africans who are Muslim, but Islam as a religion didn't really start and spread until around 632 after Muhammad dies, right? And so up to that time, the mid 600s, there were these, many different tribal religions, and they were kind of squashed out, if you will, by the spread of Islam as well as Christianity. So this is a British missionary to Akua and other Christians. They're in this missionary setting, and it's just pretty outright racist, obviously. All people on the Black continent, so he didn't even say Africa, all people on the Black continent must give up their heathenism and turn to God. Be thankful that the British are here to show you how to live a good and moral life. Um, Again, these are words of the author Gyasi, but you can just sort of imagine this kind of thing actually being told to um, either freely African religion practicing natives in Africa, or indigenous people, or or people who were enslaved across the globe. That like, oh yeah, you should be thankful that we're bringing you Christianity because your religion is heathenism. I mean, that's just so derogatory and pretentious and arrogant. Um, and then I'll just do one more here. So this is toward the end of the novel, and Marcus, who spoiler alert, actually ends up with the Black Stone from Marjorie. Says the narrator says here, Marcus had told his grandmother this one of the excuse me, told his grandmother this after one of the Sunday dinners, and she told him that maybe he had the gift of visions. But Marcus could never make himself believe in the God of Ma Willie. And so he had gone about looking for family and searching for answers in a more tangible way through his research and writing. And we learned that Marcus is earning a PhD at Stanford, I believe, in sociology, right? So he's become secular. So toward the end of the novel, religion of both, the ancestral tribal religions of Africa, but also Christianity are becoming less and less important to the younger characters in the novel. So, number of possible, textual evidence, and these are just some, folks. I didn't go through every single example because again, this would be a super long video. Question 2 asks, a key tenet of critical race theory is that racism is quote unquote ordinary, meaning that it's kind of has been, always will be, it's an everyday thing. Can this sense of ordinariness also be applied to slavery and homegoing? For example, James makes it clear that, quote, America is not the only place with slaves. It's page 103. Explain clearly and thoroughly by citing examples. So again, I'm giving you, kind of doing the legwork for you here, giving you examples. And under part 2 here, section 2, is it ordinary? There are many, many examples to substantiate that probably it is. So this is not a quote, but it's if you began the novel, you readily were probably taken or bowled over, as I was, by the domestic violence and physical abuse of by Baba, who is, as we learn in the chapter 1, basically like the stepmother to Afia. Afia's mother is, we come to learn, Mame, the house girl of Kobe Akhtar, and Baba resents the fact that she has to take care of a daughter who is not her own. And so she abuses her terribly. I mean, leaving scars, and the cycle is the stepmother Baba will commit physical violence on the stepdaughter Afia. Then the father Kobe Akhtar will beat Baba, and leave scars on her, and then like it happens again over and over again, right? So I bring this up because it's not, in the proper sense, like she's in shackles, but it's a kind of ordinariness of violence, right? Like she can't get away from home. The only way for her to leave is to get married, which of course she has to do. So I just bring that as a, kind of maybe, Afia and others are born into this abuse. And later, later, it's mentioned that there's a a switch, right, to go get a switch to beat someone. Um, let me see if I have that in here. Um, and so, if you've ever been spanked or beaten with a switch or that kind of thing, it's this cycle of domestic violence, right? Um, yeah, this is on page 35. After Mame and S.A. chose one of the prisoners as a house girl, right? So remember, Mame isn't really a character. She's just kind of in the background because she, basically ran away during the fire that was in the opening. They just basically enslaved this girl who's a prisoner, right? So these Fante people, right, enslave one of the Asante girls. She's useless, Mame said to Big Man. We have to take her back. Take her back to where? Odo, or meaning love, like my love or beloved. There's only one way to train a slave. Essie, go and get my switch. Right. And this is really a memory at the time. So it's really not like Mame is on the scene as a character. But I just wanted to point that out. It's there, that cycle of domestic violence. So slavery is ordinary, right? This is when she has to go get married. Yes, we get iron and millet. Millet is a type of grain, but we must give them things in return. That man came from Cape Coast to marry Adwoa, and there will be more. Sorry, that should be like him. My apologies. More like him who will come and take our daughters away. So I believe this is one of the men who's interested in Ifia, one of the sort of like princess of the tribe, telling her like, you gotta wake up and smell the coffee, so to speak. That this is the way things are, unfortunately. And here he is again, Fifi, I believe is probably how you pronounce his name, and he just says it outright. Like, we are helping the British and the Asantes with their trade. Abiku has made an alliance with one of the most powerful Asante villages. We will help them sell their slaves to the British. Right. So it's, one of the things, like it said here by, the white guy, James Collins, right, that America is not the only place with slaves, that it becomes clear that the slave trade was facilitated and enabled by the people of West Africa themselves. It wasn't as though, you had the British or Dutch or Belgians or whomever go in and, just without any kind of network, go in and capture people. The sort of hard work in some ways was already done for them, because they just kind of pulled up to the coast in their ships, and they were already there in the dungeon and the castle, and they paid for them and left. And so there's a reference to that when they're talking about the Cape Coast castle. on page 25. He says, that was what the Asantes, excuse me, that's just what the Asantes traffic most here, beasts, because that's how they're being, people, human beings, my God, are being referred to as beasts. She had seen Afia had seen James look at a king crown, so an actual like tribal leader's crown, brought in by one of their Asante traders and declared that it was worth £4. But what about the human beast? How much was he worth? Avia had known, of course, that there were people in the dungeons, people who spoke a different dialect than her, people who had been captured, in tribal war. I'm sorry, my typing is terrible here. But if you go to page 25, you'll see he was captured in tribal war. Even people who had been stolen, right? So, she's aware that even though she kind of lives in a kind of relative speaking privileged life, if she's not in the dungeon, she's married to this British soldier, James Collins. She's aware that what's going on down in the castle. So this I'm skipping a bit in the novel here. This is kind of in the middle of the novel. And this is a conversation. Yeah, I believe it's in the Kojo chapter. So they're in the American South here. And if you've ever read the account or seen the film, was it 17 Years a Slave? I'm getting that number wrong, of course. You can see it. Let's I'm going to kick myself for not knowing this. It's 12 years. I don't know why I said 17. So this is a fairly famous narrative now because it was made into a film. But what they're describing here, or what Gyasi is describing in the novel, is actually accounted for in real life by Solomon Northrop, who's the actual author of this narrative, and edited by the African American scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. So there was, unfortunately, this law that was passed, and this is what's being referred to here. We've been hearing about a new law being drafted by the South and the Free Soilers. And if it was to pass, law enforcement would be required to arrest any alleged runaway slave in the North and send them back south, no matter how long ago they escaped. Anna's master had fathered her, then set her and her mother free. She had real free papers, not forged ones like Joe and Ma'aku. But that doesn't stop the law enforcement or police in, say, Baltimore in the novel from hunting down and enslaving people, which actually happens in the novel. So there's this way in which, and I'm not sure if the novelist Gyasi did this deliberately, but she's incorporating a real life feature that Northrop describes in his own life, because he was a free man, of being unlawfully sold into slavery because he never was a slave, right? So again, this is under the notion is slavery ordinary. I'll just do one last one here. So this is a bit of a spin, but you could argue that, in our current income gap, our current educational gap, and all other kinds of disparities in our nation, that it really stems from the sort of terrible effects, ripple effects of slavery. And this is toward the end of the novel, when Sonny, who is, well, we learn a heroin addict in Harlem, that Marcus, his son, the one who, ends up having a kind of better quality of life by going to Stanford, getting a PhD, that, the way that Sonny views the world, not unsurprisingly, is that it's still a kind of world of oppression, right? And so it says here, Sonny would tell Marcus about how America used to lock up Black men off the sidewalks for labor, or how redlining kept banks from investing in Black neighborhoods, preventing mortgages or business loans. So was it a wonder that prisons were still full of them? Was it a wonder that the ghetto was the ghetto? So, this is part of what critical race theory, if you remember the question, right? That critical race theory says, and critical race theory is looking at, the sort of intersection of law, education, politics, religion, and so on, that all of these mechanisms in our country, sort of force people into this, kind of second class citizenhood that you could argue, is obviously still going on. So let's move on to the third essay question with some examples, and that is, again, how or in what ways does the Black stone necklace function as a foundation for a braided or interwoven narrative structure? And I already showed you some, possible themes that you could key on. But here are some examples of the Black stone itself in the novel. Remember, Baba's the stepmother, if you will, of Effia. Baba slips Black stone necklace into Effia's hand upon announcement of marriage to James Collins, asserting, take this with you when you go. So this is Baba to Effia. Take this with you when you go, a piece of your mother, that is Mame, as if the blackness of the stone corresponds to the darkness or evil and bad omen in both Effia and her unnamed mother. So in other words, Baba is sort of like, in her mind, like, get rid of this because, you and this stone are nothing but a curse to the family. What I've written here at the end on this bracketed section is that I don't know that Gyasi is doing this deliberately, but there's a kind of parallel between, the first wife versus the second wife, if you will. Because remember that Mame, Effia's mother, is a house girl. In other words, she's not Baba, the original wife. So in Genesis, we learned that Abraham and Sarah, they first have a son named Isaac. Remember, Abraham's about to stab his son Isaac as a sacrifice to God, and God holds his hand, right? And then much later, when Sarah is too old to bear children, Abraham takes his, well, it's a slave girl. Hagar is an Egyptian slave girl who's basically Sarah's housemaid or chambermaid, house girl, like, Iffia's mother, Mame, who ran away during the fire. So he has a child with Abraham has a child with Hagar, and he is named Ishmael. And Isaac and Ishmael are half brothers, but they also are kind of at odds with each other. So Isaac will go on to eventually produce the line that has Jesus, and Ishmael will go on to produce the line that eventually has Muhammad and thus Islam. So, there's some interesting kind of parallels in this relationship. um, so again, touching the stone, as I mentioned earlier, gives people comfort. So this is in the sort of middle of part 2 section of the novel, where Yah, as he's known, Yah, who is Marjorie's father, remember he's the school teacher. Yah's mother pulled Afia's necklace from her neck then and held it out to Yah. I'm sorry, should be a W there. My apologies for my typing. It glowed black in her hand. Again, emphasis on the color. He touched it, felt the smoothness of it. And this is Yah's mother talking here. I took the necklace to the fetish man's son. In tribal Africa, there was something called a fetish, or fetico, as the Portuguese called it, which is where we get the word. And it really kind of meant, like something you wore on or around your neck, like, a pendant or amulet to ward off evil spirits, right? And you could say that that's what's going on here with the necklace, at least for Marjorie and other people. Anyway, she says, I took the necklace to the man's son, the fetish man's son, so that I could make offerings to our ancestors so they might stop punishing me. The fetish man dropped the necklace very suddenly and said, do you know there is evil in your lineage? This thing you are carrying, it does not belong to you. He said that the black stone belonged to the fire woman. And that was why it grew hot in his hand. Of course, the fire woman being Mame. And so in some ways, the stone isn't a stone of comfort, but is in some ways a burden to the family, right? Is perhaps a curse, right? That is carried down through generations. Remember, there's the stone necklace she wore every day, and she's she's required to wear it every day because her father says not to give it away. All right. And toward the very end of the novel, this is literally on the last page, the stone is given to Marcus by Marjorie. So this is when they're in the water. Marcus could hear Marjorie laughing, and soon he laughed too. When he finally reached her, she was moving just enough to keep her head above water. The black stone necklace rested just below her collarbone, and Marcus watched the glints of gold come off it, shining in the sun. Here, Marjorie said, have it. She lifted the stone from her neck and placed it around Marcus's. Welcome home. He felt the stone hit his chest hard and hot before finding its way up to the surface again. He touched it, surprised by its weight. Of course, there's, a pun on weight, meaning burden, significance, but also physical weight. So this is kind of where we get the homegoing of the novel, right? They've returned, Marcus and Marjorie have returned to Ghana, because remember, they're, raised and America, as is Gyasi. So she does, in fact, give it away, even though she's told by her father not to. And one wonders, is that her freeing herself of the burden that it's supposedly this kind of curse or evil, as the fetish son fetish man's son says, um, or is she sort of making a gift of it to Marcus, who becomes her partner, right, as we learn. And we don't know for a fact, but they will probably get married, and thus continue the line. She gifting it to him in a positive way, or what, right? But that's the final instance of the stone. All right, let's move on to number 4. This is about history in general. How or in what ways is Homegoing correcting the problem of history through storytelling, explained clearly and thoroughly by exciting examples from the novel? So again, I'm helping you out here. So the novel itself, right, is storytelling, and from multiple perspectives in a kind of interwoven way, as I mentioned. But at the same time, the way she tells a story allows the characters to re-see or re-envision how their history, how they sort of fit in the family tree or lineage, right? So you could say that there's a kind of revisioning going on. And it begins early. So here in chapter 1, Baba's interpretation of Afia being born during a fire causes Afia's supposed lack of menstruation. Now, if you remember, one of the things the stepmother Baba does is she makes Afia lie about her coming of age, so to speak, by not letting anyone know that she's actually gotten her period. Because on the one hand, if she had gotten her period, then that means she was immediately of marriable age to bear children, and they could, basically marry her off as they were supposed to do. But secondly, what it allows Baba to do, we learn, is to enact this kind of conniving characterization of Afia, that the reason she's now 17, 18, she's now a late teenager and she has not yet gotten her period, is because she's damaged goods. She's evil because she was born in a fire. It's pretty, again, aside from the physical abuse of Baba, the stepmother, to the stepdaughter, this is also like kind of psychological warfare, that she calls her a creature that is beautiful but cannot be touched, right? And she capitalizes on 30 pounds and more, kind of installment plan later, 30 pounds, which was a lot back then in the 1770s. She capitalizes on James Collins' ignorance of Afia's actual fertility. In other words, James Collins thinks that he's getting basically, a virgin, someone who's never gotten their period yet, but of course, Baba knows otherwise. So that's certainly, a kind of historical revision of Afia's own life. Here's another early example. Kobe Akhtar, he's Afia's father. Kobe had always said that the joining of a man and woman was also the joining of two families, ancestors, whole histories, came with the act, but so did sins and curses. But it was Kobe who prophesied about a sullied lineage. Afia couldn't help but think that she was fighting against her own womb, fighting against the fire children. So there's this way in which people are psychologically affected, you might even say somewhat traumatized, by the fire that causes the supposed sullied lineage, right? Let's maybe move further into the novel. Um, yeah, here's an example. Again, this is, later when in part two, Marcus, studying for his PhD at Stanford, is doing research, and he begins to kind of see that, like, pulling one thread, if you will, of this kind of research begins to take on this, almost infinite um, weight. Originally, Marcus had wanted to focus on his work on the convict leasing system that has stolen years off his great grandpa H's life. H, remember, there's a whole chapter or so devoted to his life. He was the coal miner in the South. But the deeper into the research he got, the bigger the project got. How could he talk about great grandpa H's story without also talking about Grandma Willie and the millions of other Black people who had migrated north, fleeing Jim Crow? If he mentioned the Great Migration, he'd have to talk about the cities that took that flock in. He'd have to talk about Harlem. And if he was going to talk about heroin in Harlem in the 60s, wouldn't he also have to talk about crack everywhere in the 80s? And so this last part is a kind of direct allusion to his own, personal embarrassment, if you will, of his father, Sonny. Remember, Sonny is the um, jazz artist in Harlem that becomes addicted. But, it's a kind of more contemporary picture that if you look at the historical record, if you will, that these things, like, I mentioned earlier, redlining, these things are all kind of interconnected, right? That you can't look at just one thing in isolation because everything is really connected to everything else. So it kind of bowls him over in terms of, doing this uh, research project. Well, his dissertation, basically, right? Um, so this is, again, toward the end of the novel. And this is Marjorie talking to Marcus. So this is the Asante region, because remember, they're going to Ghana. Marjorie said to Marcus, pointing to a map of Ghana on her wall. This is technically where my family's from, but my grandmother moved to the central region right here to be closer to the beach. Now, that's a bit of an interesting spin, right? Because I showed you some maps a little bit earlier. Let me go back to you. Excuse me. My throat is just killing me. Uh, so, right. Is it this one? This one. The one that has the central regions in it is what I'm looking for. Yeah. So remember that um, the central region, as it's called here, is central because it's on this sort of center of the coast, even though I can't show, yeah, center of the coast, right? Not center in the Ghana country itself. Um, and that this northern region here is where the Asante people were captured from. So what she says, Marcus to, I'm sorry, Marjorie to Marcus, she says, my grandmother moved from the north, because this is north, to the south to be near or closer near toward the coast. Um, that isn't really accurate, is it? Right? I mean, that's what she was told, right? But if you go back as far as, say, Afia, who's way more than her grandmother, um, the reason that they moved was because she was basically sold by Bava, the stepmother, to James Collin, the soldier, to be married. And he was right there on the Cape Coast castle. So again, this question is asking about historical revision, right? Things that are told in one historical period as being this way, and then they get revised, sort of distorted over time. Also toward the end of the novel. Uh, so this is the tourist guide, and I showed you an image, right, of, if I can go back and show you another one, where um, Obama and his family here, right, are being, told to, we're being told about the origins of people in the slave trade at the Cape Coast Castle. But this is in the novel. And the guide says, in fact, many of the British soldiers married local women, and their children, along with other local children, would go to school right here in this upper level. Other children would be sent to England for school, and they would come back to form an elite class. Apologies, that should be and instead of A-N-D. So even the tour guide is kind of buying into this fact that these, for lack of a better term, these children who were sent to English school, a kind of privileged life, are somehow coming back in a better way. And that's only because their education was valued by the colonists who sent them back to England or Europe. And so it's a kind of glossing over the fact that they were still forcibly sent, taken from their families to a foreign country and educated in the white man's way or European way. And then because of the education they had, they formed an elite class, right? Very, very curious storytelling. All right, and the final question here is about colorism. How does colorism within Ghana or the American South function as a mechanism of oppression? There are many, many examples throughout the novel of characters and the narrator keying on or mentioning skin color as curiosities. So it begins early on here, and this is in the sort of opening line. In 1775, Adwa Aidu became the first girl of village to be proposed to by one of the British soldiers. And she was given 15 pounds for her, or her bride price, as it's called. Remember, that's only half of what Afia earned for Baba, right? Remember, Afia the beauty. And the first white person Afia sees is a British soldier. And Afia describes the soldier as red and sallow. Sallow is this, sort of pale and what do you call it? Wan, or, almost gray, ashen looking, right? And red could be, we call ruddy complexion, So, there's this recognition early on that there's a skin color difference by Ifia and people around her. Ifia walked around with James in complete awe, running her hands along the fine furniture made from wood, the color of her father's skin. And I asked, so is also Ifia dark? And the color of her father's skin is probably, though the narrator doesn't come out and say it, a reference to mahogany because it's, wood. And mahogany, of course, is almost black. Um, and remember, Afia is Kobe Akhtar's daughter from the, house girl, Mame, and possibly, therefore, is of a darker skin color, right? Um, so here's a, talking about darkest skin. Um, and they chose a girl, decided to call her Abramnoma, little dove. The girl had the darkest skin Essie had ever seen. This is, when they're basically selecting a slave girl, a house girl. She kept her eyes low, and though her Twi was as passable, she rarely spoke it. Twi is one of the uh, dialectic languages of the Akan people. Um, Here, this is in the American South. There's a reference to uh, Robert Clifton and him being white, basically, uh, or super light skin. Willie, remember, this is a woman. Willie wasn't coal black. She'd seen enough coal in her lifetime to know that was for sure because her father, H, right, was a coal miner. But the day Robert Clifton came with his father to the union meeting to hear Willie sing, all she could think was that he had the whitest black boy skin she had ever seen. And because she thought that, her own skin had started to look to her more and more like the thing her father brought home from the mines, that is, coal. Robert Clifton's father was the color of coffee, but Robert was the color of cream. Willie was used to seeing white and black together in Pratt City, but she had never seen both things in one family, both in one person, right? So there's this, kind of internalization that Willie does there, right? Of kind of juxtaposing her darker skin to Willie's Robert Clifton's lighter skin. But that doesn't prevent them from getting married, as we learn. And there's this long section here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can, on your own time, go look at it on pages 268 to 69. But there's this term here called Obriani, or excuse me, Obrani. And Obrani is a Ghanaian term to mean someone who is basically different, typically in appearance, right? So, if you were in Ghana, and you saw a Chinese person show up, you might say Obrani, as the kids do here, right? But what's happening here is a kind of weaving together of what's happening to Marjorie in a high school in Alabama with what she kind of remembers in Ghana about the way the the Ghana boys treated her. She was entering high school, right, on the southeast side of Huntsville. They were the only black family on the, sorry, no, it should be the block. My apologies, terrible. Did not go back and proofread this, obviously. They were the only black family on the block, the only black people for miles and miles and miles. At her new high school, there were more black children than Marjorie was used to seeing in Alabama, but it only took a few conversations with them for Marjorie to realize that they were not the same kind of black that she was, that indeed she was the wrong kind. And then it skips to, this schoolmate of hers, I wouldn't say friend, but schoolmate of hers, asking why she's reading this novel. I believe it's Middlemarch by, a British novelist. I have to read it for class because that's what Marjorie says. I have to read it for class. I have to read it for class, Tisha mimicked. You sound like a white girl, white girl, white girl, white girl, because a bunch of the kids around her started chiming in with that refrain. In Ghana, whenever a white person appeared, there was always a child there to point him out. A small group of children, dark and shiny in the equatorial sun, would extend their little fingers toward the person whose skin was different from theirs and shout, Obroni, Obroni. Her father had told her that the word had come to mean something entirely different from what it used to mean, that the young of Ghana itself, an infant country, had been born to a place emptied of its colonizers, right? That, most of the Dutch and British people were gone because the slave trade was over. Because they didn't see white men every day the way people of his mother's generation and older had, the world could take on word, should be word, I apologize, the word could take on new meaning for them. They lived in Ghana where they were the majority, where theirs was the only skin color for miles around, right? So it's a way in which she learns, Marjorie, that um, her own blackness, right, if you will, as she calls it, is not just physically and skin tone different than her Alabama high school mates, if you will, but that it's coupled together with her cultural difference, right? In fact, that's kind of played out in the next passage here when the teacher, Mrs. Pinkston, is talking, has them kind of do like this exercise in class about, talk about what being an African American means to you. And Marjorie's like, but I'm not African American, right? She was like the author, born in Ghana and raised in the South, right? So somewhat autobiographical there. Um, she wanted to tell Mrs. Pinkston that at home they had a different word for African Americans, Akata. The Akata people were different from Ghanans too long gone from their mother continent to continue calling it the mother continent, right? That, there's a way in which after literally decades and hundreds of years, centuries, that, you're removed from that kind of cultural and ethnic groundedness, if you will, from, the actual land. And Mrs. Pinkston says, listen, Marjorie, I'm going to tell you something that maybe nobody's told you yet. Here in this country, meaning America, but also especially the South, it doesn't matter where you come from first to the white people running things. You're here now, and black is black is black. So it's curious, right? That, okay, yeah, you can get that in the kind of racist tenor that it is, but which, doesn't excuse it, but, that kind of in some ways erases the sense of self, if you will, of Marjorie. She's like, yeah, but I'm, like, don't put me in that category of African American because I don't see myself that way, right? Yeah. And then this reference when Marcus is talking to his buddy Dante, I believe, right? That there's this girl, she's blue black, they would have called her on the playgrounds in Harlem, right? And he's actually referring to Marjorie here. That is, this is Marcus's sort of perceptual view the first time he sees Marjorie, that she's blue black, right? Yeah. So there are a bunch, again, examples of colorism and how it affects people's perception of themselves and each other, and you could certainly write about that. I apologize for all the typos in the textual evidence, but when you go right to the actual page, you'll find the right passage or quotation. So again, this is for module 4, the essay on homegoing, 3 to 5 double space pages, following this outline, folks. Follow this outline. It's not meant to be, again, a research paper. It's, kind of straightforward. And that is due a week from today, Monday, October 24th. I hope this information helps. Stay well and take care.